Watching Tikkun 11 years later is filled with a double pathos. The first pathos is the pathos of the pandemic. Because I was here. We were here. We remember when we all first saw Tikkun 11 years ago at the Yom HaShoah Commemoration in the Rabbi Samuel Chill Sanctuary, and the sanctuary was overflowing with people. Every seat was taken, and it was a moment, and it was an event, and there was the intensity that comes. Barov Am Hadrat Melech, the king's glory, the Psalms say, is felt in the presence of a crowd, and we felt that night, and of course tonight, the second year of Yom HaShoah and a pandemic, it's a very different experience. But there's a whole other level of pathos, and anyone who watched Tikkun experienced that pathos, and that's the pathos of the changes that time brings. There's, of course, the pathos of aging. Most of us look 11 years older. There's also the pathos of loss. Lucia David, Mike Turner were both strong and radiant and robust 11 years ago, and both have gone to their eternal rest. But there is also the pathos of hope. I was struck by Hannah and Max Stober, who were young children on their mother's knees at that time. Cheryl's 11 years ago. They were just children, and now they're young, strong adults. Blair Borden, who was a teen, a young woman. And there's the pathos of hope and the pathos of determination, because all of the urgency that was expressed by children and grandchildren of survivors. Never again for us, never again for anyone else. That is even stronger 11 years later. And one person who embodies all of this, the pathos of loss, the pathos of hope, the pathos of determination, and the pathos of surviving the Shoah, and the pathos of surviving the pandemic, is our beloved Chana Berkovitz. Chana is just the most amazing person. I saw her tonight. We all saw her tonight. She's dressed in purple. She dresses in purple. She dresses in pink. She says things like chibuk shel ahava, an embrace of love. She says things like chibuk shel chesed, an embrace of kindness. After all she's been through and after all she's lost, she radiates love and kindness, decency, strength, and resilience. Our beloved, our precious Chana Berkovitz is now going to read from the Survivor Torah.
I am very conscious of the preciousness of life. Nature, flowers, children, they enhance our life.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך, ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ובשכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך.
We light a candle on Yom HaShoah to remember that the 6 million were 6 million individuals. Every candle that you received has a name attached to it, of a man, of a woman, of a child who perished in the flames. We remember and we vow to always remember. And in that spirit of a sacred and eternal promise to remember, we turn now to Nate Birnbaum, Bill Getzler, Lynette Politan, all children of survivors, to light the candle that means we will always remember.
For me, what's important to tell my children is that, yes, you need to hear the story, you need to tell the story for the reason so that it will never, ever happen again. Period.
Hi, I'm Jack Politan. I'm here with Presley and Ella and Maven and Asher and Lynette and Hudson and Brody and Mitch. And they have something to say.
We light this candle in memory of all the children who lost their lives in the Holocaust.
I think it's important that my kids and my neighbors and friends and their children understand that this didn't happen in a history book. It happened to people they know.
Today I'm surrounded by my family here in our house in Newton, my wife Julie and my sons Mark and Nathan, and also surrounded remotely at least by my daughter Emily in Michigan. And today we remember and we honor the relatives who aren't with us and who unfortunately I never met, whose lives were taken much too early. Two of my uncles and my grandfather, as well as countless other cousins and other relatives who I've never met. And I remember all the Passover Seders and all the other holiday dinners that we've had over the years, where there's been empty seats, and how sorry I was as a kid that those seats weren't filled with the relatives who we lost. But I also want to celebrate both the people who saved my mother's life, without whom we wouldn't be here, and also celebrate my children whose presence proves that those who took my relatives' lives didn't win.
Well, the main reason that we should never forget is, as it was said, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it.
My name is Robin Birnbaum. I'm married to Nathan Birnbaum, and we're here to commemorate Yom HaShoah with our 3 adult children and their spouses. One of our adult children, Danny, is married in Los Angeles with Hope. He has 3 children, Ella, Maya, and Jake. And they're waving hello. And then we have the Aronson family in Natick. It's Abby and Charlotte. And we have the Melmond family in Needham. And it's Jason, Erica, Landon, and Camilla.
Heidi in bed too.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot that. Oh, and I forgot Heidi. Those are Abby and Charlotte's parents. So it's more special because we have so many to share the memories with and remember all of our ancestors.
We're going to be lighting tonight in memory not only of the 6 million, but especially in our own family, all of my grandparents. And my mother had 5 siblings, 4 of whom perished in the Holocaust. My father only had 1 sibling, a sister, and she perished in the Holocaust as well. And many, many other cousins and most of the people in the family from Poland who perished in the Holocaust. And my father spent 3 years in concentration camps, but he was in 6 different camps. And he met my mother seeing her through a fence in another camp. And ultimately, they got together after the war when they were liberated and got married. And we came over to America in 1949 when I was 2.5 years old.
Let us stars up above, so far away we only see the light, long, long after the star itself is gone. And so it is with people that we love, the memories keep shining ever lightly, though their time with us is done. But the stars that light up the darkest night, these are the lights that guide us as we live our days. These are the ways we remember, as we live our days. These are the ways we remember, יש כוכבים שאורם מגיע ארצה, רק כאשר הם עצמם עבדו בינם. יש עננים שזיו זכרם מאיר, כאשר הם עצמם אינם עוד ברוחנו. אורות אלה המאביקים בין חשכת העין, הם אבן שמראים לאדם את הדרך, את הדרך. הם אבן שמראים לאדם את הדרך, את הדרך. As we live our days, these are the ways we remember, as we live our days, these are the ways we remember, we remember.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm so appreciative for you joining us this evening at our Temple Emanuel Yom HaShoah Commemoration. I'm Danny Mando, and it's my privilege and honor to introduce our panel discussion tonight. The 4 panelists, we all have a special bond. Everyone that you've seen in this movie that Naomi Rizel did for us 11 years ago has a unique bond with each other. Dennis and Naomi, the daughter of David and myself, came up with this idea 11 years ago. So much has really changed. And Varda and Arnie and all the participants we all met. We actually met to talk about this, and we decided that after tonight, we will continue to meet because we have so much to unpack, so much to share, and so many feelings. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our four panelists, led by our beloved Rabbi Robinson, Dennis Buchenholz, Arnie Lowenstein, Naomi Greenfield, and Varda Farber. Thank you.
Danny, thank you so very much. This evening is just brimming with all of the love that you have put into the holy task that we all share tonight of remembering. So thank you very, very much. And to each of you here with me tonight, it's such a privilege to be able to have the opportunity to ask you the most important question, which is, what has changed for you over the past 11 years since the film was made? And what has endured or even sharpened for you over time? I'd like to begin by asking you, Varda, to take that question.
Thank you, Rabbi. What has changed? Well, I think the biggest change for me from the time we made the film is that we've had 5 grandchildren born in these 10 years, and another one, God willing, will be born later this month. I'm a second-generation survivor. My children are third. My grandchildren are now 4th generation, and they are alive. It's a legacy to my parents who through sheer willpower and bravery and Ezrat Hashem, God's blessing, survived. It's interesting that their young adulthood was a very, very, very dark time for them, for the world. And right after that, I was born into light in the state of Israel. And I think that, that was what their mission was. Their goal was to survive, to have a land of their own, and to build a family. And they managed to do that. I feel that no matter what I am doing, I am a guardian of their memories and their legacy, and that my parents' hand is somehow always on my shoulder, guiding me to live through the lessons that their lives provided for them and now for us.
Thank you so much, Varda. Naomi.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. It's so nice to be here with everyone. When I was thinking about this, just so much has, I guess, changed, obviously, in everyone's lives, sort of in 10 years. When I watched that little bit of the film, I was remembering that I was very, very newly pregnant with my first daughter when we did that filming. In fact, I don't think anyone aside from my close family knew. So, a big change over the 10 years was just becoming a parent, which changes a lot of things. But I think for me, it also changed a lot in my thinking about what these two children, their relationship was going to be to the Holocaust and to their legacy as 4th generation descendants of the Holocaust. So we talk a lot in Holocaust education about how it changes so much when there are no longer survivors. And so for my children, like, they are both named after their survivor great-grandchildren, but have never met them. So I thought a lot about sort of how to sort of raise them, understanding that legacy that they hold, but without having those people there for them. The second sort of big change for me, I would say, in the past year was related to my role as a descendant of survivors, has to do with like my political activism. And I think I sort of think about a specific moment in July of 2016. It was actually the weekend that Elie Wiesel died, and it was also a weekend that there was an anti-Semitic meme that sort of came from some neo-Nazi websites about Hillary Clinton. And I remember at the time being like, well, this is what we've talked about when we say not to let things happen again. Like, this is the beginning of it, is the starting of these propaganda images and things. And I remember distinctly at that time thinking that part of my role as a descendant of a survivor is to be on high alert when those things start to come up. And that really, really kickstarted my involvement in the 2016 campaign and the 2018 campaign and the 2020 campaign. And then also I became involved in politics locally and became the chair of the Human Rights Commission in my town. And unfortunately, that ended up being a very important role because over the past 6 years, there's been sort of a rise in a lot of hate crimes and hate incidents. And I sort of, in my role there and just in my role as a descendant of a survivor, had to be the respondent to a number of hate incidents that were going on in Arlington and in my town, including 2 arson attempts at the Chabad house in Arlington. And so I just always think of like my role and my history as like the lens through which I approached a lot of the sort of the roles that I had. And then sort of the last piece I think a lot of is in how I think of Holocaust education as sort of such an important role that survivors take on. Sort of we spend a lot of time thinking about our personal connection, and then to me, a lot of that has to then go from being internal to external. How do we help educate based on like the deep knowledge that we may have about the Holocaust? And I actually, a lot of the things that I remembered from doing Yom HaShoah when I was growing up in Temple Emanuel, like delivering the yellow candles with my dad around the neighborhood. I brought that to my synagogue now at Temple Isaiah, and we have a yellow candle distribution program, and I do that with the religious school students and try to get them involved with marking the day in a really important way. And then the project that I'm most really proud of is a project that I'm doing with the New England Holocaust Memorial. So coming up in the next month or two, there's going to be an app that you can use when you're navigating around the New England Holocaust Memorial that I've been working on to sort of really bring Holocaust education out into the community. So those are sort of the big things for me in the past 10 years.
Wow, Naomi, thank you so much. Dennis, 11 years, what has changed for you? What has endured?
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to this panel. Thank you, Rabbi Robinson. So since the film was made, I would say there are 2 major things that have changed, but one that has endured and stayed the same. So 11 years ago, my family consisted of my wife, Marilyn, me, and our 2 young adult children, Michael and Jessica, who were 3 Gs. Today, our family has expanded to include 3 grandchildren that are now 4 Gs. I have a son-in-law, Brett, a daughter-in-law, Julie, who are now parents of a 4G. And I have Machatanim, who are grandparents of 4Gs. So I look at it, while the list of survivors is dwindling, the number of Jews connected to the Holocaust tree is growing. So I find this to be encouraging. And I look forward to the day when all of my grandchildren are old enough where I could actually tell them stories myself that my parents had told me. A second thing that's changed goes back to the film. So when the film was made, it was the first time the focus of the Yom HaShoah program was on 2 Gs and 3 Gs and not just survivors. And so many spoke up for the first time, including me. And since then, I have broadened my experience in speaking to others about the Holocaust. And I've done this with the help of one of our congregants, Jacqueline Hallow, who maybe more people know as Jacqueline Bunis. She's invited me several times to speak to her 8th grade students in a Brookline school, and to talk to them about the Holocaust, because there are fewer survivors who are able to do so. And it's a very moving experience for me. and it's the same also for the students, and it expands my Holocaust remembrance and teaching to others who are not Jewish. Finally, the one thing that's remained constant since the 11 years is the importance of being Jewish and leading a Jewish life. It is important that I'm able to that I'm here, I'm Jewish, we're still alive, and the Nazis aren't in power. Thank you.
Dennis, thank you very much. Arnie.
Yes, I want to begin by talking about sort of changes that I think have changed since 2010 at a more macro level. Because I think one of the main things that's changed is fewer and fewer survivors remain in the last 11 years. And in my case, I have just one aunt that's still living. She's now 98 years old, and she survived from kinder transport, and that's it. So it's sort of a sign of there are few remaining. And the second thing is the rising anti-Semitism, and I think that's changed. And it's both in very sort of direct in your face forms and more subtle forms, and obviously both are bad. And as well as the growing number of people and deniers of the Holocaust. And what concerns me is when you put that brew together, it can be a pretty toxic brew. And if we've learned anything from our history, that's one thing we should really take to heart. On a personal level, I think the major change for me was the trip that we took 2 years ago to Poland and with the group from the synagogue. And it's hard to describe the experience. You can read about the Holocaust. You can watch documentaries. You can watch films by Steven Spielberg. But it's not the same, or even listen to your family and know what your family might have gone through. But when you actually go and you see the ash that we saw, the mountain of human ash at Majdanek, or you go to the Auschwitz and you see Arbat Machrai, and you actually see the sign and it's not a part of the film. Or you take the march from Auschwitz to Birkenau, and when you know that was sort of the death march that people went on, and we went on as free people. You can't help but it sort of hits you, and it hits you in a very different way than a movie, and it becomes so personal. And I think that's sort of the major change for me. The other part of it was a really personal one, was sort of, if you want to call it, a family discovery that happened on our trip. And my father was from Dusseldorf, and my grandparents were in Dusseldorf. I won't talk about my father's story, but my grandparents were deported from Dusseldorf in 1941 to the large ghetto, and our trip was going to the large ghetto. So I had looked up whether there was information. I had known for a while an address where my grandparents were supposed to have been, at least for some number of months while they're in the large ghetto. And I asked our guide, our Polish guide, as well as our driver, whether they knew where this address was. And they thought they did, because the streets at that point were German named. They'd been renamed into German streets, but they thought they knew what the street was. So our bus with all our team, our call-it groups went, and we pulled in front of a building that was the address. And we drove up to the building, and it was an old apartment building. And we saw on that building a plaque, and on the plaque that said, "This is where the Jews of Düsseldorf were housed for approximately 6 months until around October of 1941. My grandfather was starved to death in the large ghetto. So the next place we went was the cemetery. And my late father didn't know that his father was buried. But what we found out through the help of they told us that there's a place at the back of the cemetery where there's fields. And in those fields are buried the 42,000 or so that either starved or died of typhus in the large ghetto. And Eric Garchuk, who went on the trip with us, was able to find the record of my grandfather. And we were able to walk up to the field. It was an empty field where he was buried, and say Kaddish. And since then, I was able to contact the the cemetery, and they've located his actual plot, and we've actually gone to the point of going to put a headstone in his memory. And my brothers and I, Valerie, my family, are looking to go back to March of the Living and put a headstone in his memory.
Amen. Arnie, I remember that day as we stood in that field and lifted up prayers, and how transformative it was, not only for you, but for the community there on the March of the Living, who shared that lesson of resilience and that lesson of legacy from generation to generation, Midor Lador. And I want to ask you and the other panelists here as well, this has been a really hard year, this pandemic year. What are some of the lessons that you've learned from your family's Holocaust story, and or the work that you've done since being involved with the film, that have been with you as you have gone through this pandemic year and have helped to shape how you have engaged the pandemic? So I'll start with you, Arnie, and then we'll move on.
Well, what the most thing I think about is how lucky we are, even though we've gone through a pandemic, and we're sort of coming out the other side. When I think about the suffering and of the people, whether it's my family or the millions of others that went through it's hard not to think about it and to say, well, you have to put it into perspective. And what I think about more and more is the courage of the people that survived, and how to survive. But it's not just the courage, that they were got them through the Holocaust, whether they were for a long time in concentration camp or had whatever their experience was. It's how to move forward without bitterness, without hate, and to carry that, because it's hard to live your life like that. And I think the people, I know my father tried to move forward, and even though they held the guilt, they held it inside, which bottled up inside, which wasn't good for any person long term. They didn't want to burden that on the children, and they wanted to move forward. The other thing I think about relates to my grandfather is what he told my father, was the story when he was on the train to Dachau, and he told them when this crowded train, my dad was 17, and he said to my father, who was really despondent, he said, "Ivri anochi," he said to him. He said, stand up and be proud of being a Jew. It's a story of Prophet Jonah. And I think that's what I take away most. And I think about it more and more, about being prideful in being Jewish and living your life that way, and standing up no matter how difficult and trying the situation is. And that's the other takeaway. And the last one final point is I think about destiny more, about Beshert, because I was born on my what would have been my grandfather's 65th birthday, and we found him his grave exactly 65 years later.
Thank you, Arnie. So beautiful. Naomi.
Yeah, I think, there was a story that I now saw, like in the film that I talked about. I remember my grandfather talking about driving when he was like an adult, and how he felt so free, and that it was something that he didn't get to do as a teenager. And there have been many times in this past year, and I would say in the past even pre-pandemic, where I've thought it was like I felt terrible feeling it, but I was sort of grateful that my Holocaust grandparents were not alive to see this sort of difficult time, because freedom was so important to them. And this year there are so many constraints on our freedom, and also it's different now when we sort of can see an end in sight, but in those early months or a year ago, it was just so hard to know how long we were going to live in this constrained time. So I thought about really just like being grateful that they didn't, have to see this time period. And then, I feel like because a big part of my identity is tied into being part of a Holocaust family, that I think about it at times when I wouldn't, maybe other people wouldn't necessarily, but I remember at a time last year, I was having a conversation with my parents about my sister-in-law, who was a frontline COVID doctor, and trying to figure out whether, whether it was, there was a time when she was going to move out of her house and leave her family to protect the safety of, the rest of her family. And just like those kind of conversations about when do you leave your family? When do you send your children away to protect them? Those were such big conversations that Jews had during the time of the Holocaust. And again, it's not the same situation, but it's just thinking about those kind of life and death decisions that we've had to all think about in the past year, is really, really hard. But then I'll tell you, just watching Hannah read Torah just made me just remember that there is just something so strong about the resilience of survivors that is just otherworldly, that even in all the difficulty that we've had this year, like there's that strength there that guides, whether it's the memories that we have of survivors or the few precious ones we have left. Like you look at her and you were like, we can survive a little longer behind a Zoom screen because Hannah Berkowitz can get up there in a mask and read the Shema. So,
Amen. Amen. Dennis.
Okay, so the pandemic has impacted me in two distinct ways. One of them is a little unusual. So the hardship for me during the pandemic was never that difficult because I compared it to what my parents went through in the Holocaust. But I realized that not many people have that perspective. The other way the pandemic impacted me was seeing how the less fortunate people in our society were impacted much more significantly than me. And it turns out I had a lot of time for reading, and I read a lot of books. And one of the books I read that really moved me was Elizabeth Wilkerson's book on caste. And while she mentions lots of issues in the book, there was one item that just totally stunned me. And it was that the Nazis studied this country and how it treated the Black race, and they used it as a framework or a roadmap for the Nuremberg race laws of 1935. And it turns out my father and his parents were living in Berlin in 1935, right when this happened. And this was the formal beginning of the Holocaust. And the country I live in now was the source, in a digital way, was the source code for the Holocaust. And this just sort of hit me really hard. So I'm currently wrestling with how I can translate my skills of remembering the past and teaching others and bring it to this area where I can expose these sad facts and help create a shared public memory. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dennis. And Varda, you'll have the final word here.
So many wise words have been spoken, and so many of the emotions and thoughts I share. I'll start with resilience, and some of you said that their resilience is amazing and their strength, the survivors. And we have to also remember that many who did not survive also had resilience. Perhaps they died of typhoid or of starvation, and they were victims, and it was through no fault of their own, and they need to be commemorated along with all of those who did survive. I'm feeling quite emotional at the moment. I think that in my home, my parents didn't speak about their experiences very much. And still, it had a profound, profound effect on me. There were words that were said. I mean, I heard the word underground, and in my little girl's mind, I was picturing my grandfather digging a hole underground. I didn't know what it meant at the time. I heard the word brigada, which is the way my parents spoke about the Jewish brigade of the British Army that my father belonged to and fought against the Nazis when they were finally given permission to join the British Army. So all of these heroics and the little words that I heard had an impact. And Michelle reminded me before we started this evening that in the original film, I said something about knowing what they survived gives me the strength to survive difficulties. And when it came to the pandemic, I felt the same thing that I think Dennis said, that my parents, my grandparents, their cousins and family members who perished because they were shot, I'm sorry, I've lost my track of thought because I'm feeling quite emotional, but that we do have that resilience, and we're fortunate in that they went through so much worse and they made it through. And I see that resilience passing on even to the next generation, in that my family survived over a decade of serious illness, and they weren't despondent, and they knew they need to keep going, and they didn't consider themselves victims, and they fought and they studied, and they came out the other end of it, strong adult human beings. And I think that we have to realize, as we do with the increase of anti-Semitism today, that unfortunately, anti-Semitism did not die in 1945. It is alive and it is well, and it is our responsibility to speak up when we hear about anything that demonizes any group of people or puts down any other group of people. I think that's our responsibility to the survivors and to the next generations.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. Varda, thank you. May their resilience inform our resilience as we continue to go on with the lessons of the Shoah imprinted on our souls and spoken from our mouths, loud and clear, ringing out through the generations. Thank you all very much for being here tonight on this panel. See you in another 11 years right back here.
Please rise. Yitgadal Auschwitz, V'yitkadash Lodz, Shemei Rabba Ponar, Be'alma Divra Kirute Babiyar, Ve'amlich Malchute Maidanek, B'chayechon U'v'yomechon Birkanel, Uvchaye Dechol Beit Yisrael Kovno, Ba'agala Uvizman Kariv Yanavska, V'yimru Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabba Mivarach La'alam Ul'amei Almaya. Yitbarach Ve'yishtabach Theresienstadt. Ve'yitpa'ar Ve'yitromam Buchenwald. Ve'yitnaseh Ve'yithadar Treblinka. Ve'yitale Ve'yithalal Vilna Shimei de Kudesha Bergen-Belsen Brichu Le'ela Mauthausen Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Dachau Tush B'chata V'nechemata Minsk Da'amiran Be'alma voisa, v'yimru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen.
El Malrachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Ametzei Merucha Nechona, Betzelek Enafecha Hashina, Bemalot Kedoshim Uteorim, Kezohar Arakia, Beirim, ומזהירים את נשמות אחינו ואחיותינו שנהרגו ושנשחטו ושנשרפו חיים. Kiddush Hashem Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Majdanek, Treblinka, Ghetto Warscha, בכל מוצא הרג והשמדה באירופה. שכולנו, כל בני ישראל, מתייחדים עם זיכרון הקדוש ומתפללים ביד על יד נשמותיהם בגן עדן תהיה מנוחתו. לכן בעל רחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיכם ארץ על תחצית בה וינוחו על משכבם ונאמר אמן.
And now we turn our hearts and our voices towards hope, towards Israel. Kol od balevav benima nefesh Yehudi homiwa ulfatei midrach kadima ayin letzion zovia od lovda tikvateinu hatikva bashnot alpayim liyotam chofshi be'artzeinu eretz Zion ירושלים, ליותם חושי בארצנו, ארץ ציון ירושלים.
לדור ודור, לדור ודור, לדור ודור, נגיד גודלך, ולנצח נצחים, ולנצח נצחים, קדוש ולנצח נצחים, קדוש ערך נקדיש, ושירך אלוהינו, מפינו לא ימוש יומם ועד, כי אל שקדוש אתה, לדור ודור, לדור ודור, לדור ודור, נגיד גודלך, ולנצח נצחים, ולנצח נצחים.